Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative Winter Webinar Series. My name is Jamie Ellis. I work as a Natural Areas Coordinator at the University of Illinois Urbana Champaign, and I am part of the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative. Just a few words about the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative. PRI is a community of prairie practitioners and researchers from more than 30 organizations working together to improve the practice of prairie reconstruction so that they are biologically diverse, ecologically functional, and resist invasion by non-native plants. We focus our activities on evidence-based tools and peer-to-peer learning. We developed a vegetation monitoring protocol that can be found on our website and a prairie reconstruction database for collecting a standard suite of data about reconstructions, and stay tuned for news about the database later this year. Let's see. When we pool and analyze data for many reconstructions, we hope to reveal pivotal elements that will increase the likelihood that all reconstructions meet expectations. Our learning opportunities include both in-person and online events where the prairie reconstruction community can exchange experiences and knowledge with each other, like today. We believe insights from both individual experiences and scientific investigation lead to our collective success. And we will be back here next week for another speaker on February 21st. So cameras and microphones will be turned off during the presentation. I'll turn them back on at the end. Please type questions and comments for the speaker in the chat, and we'll get to them at the end. This talk is being recorded and will be posted to the PRI YouTube channel at a later date. And now I am happy to introduce our speaker. Justin Meissen leads the Research and Restoration Program at the Tallgrass Prairie Center in Cedar Falls, Iowa. Justin's work focuses on implementing restoration research and demonstration projects, developing training seminars, and leading the ecological restoration efforts at the University of Northern Iowa's 300-acre Irvine Prairie. He earned a PhD in conservation biology from the University of Minnesota and a Bachelor of Science in integrative biology from the University of Illinois at Urbana Champaign. His past work evaluated the risks of repeated intensive seed harvest from native tallgrass prairies to supply large-scale prairie restoration. Justin's current research interests concentrate on issues of increasing cost effectiveness and outcome certainty in prairie reconstruction. And I will stop sharing my screen so Justin, you can share your screen, and I look forward to your talk. So take it away.
Perfect. All right. Thank you, Jamie. Are you seeing the slide properly here?
Yes, just what you projected earlier. It's just right. Yes, your title slide there. So it looks good, sir.
Very good. Okay, so I'm Justin Meissen. I'm the Research Restoration Program Manager at Tallgrass Prairie Center, again at the University of Northern Iowa. And then today I'm going to be presenting some work that I've been doing, looking at whether grass-selective herbicide can promote forbs and prevent grass overabundance in prairie reconstructions. I'm going to try to keep this presentation around 35 minutes or so we can field a good 20 minutes or so for discussion on the topic. I know a lot of folks who do prairie management might have some questions about this, or hopefully may have tried some of the things that we'll talk about, and so it'll be good to spend some time on those questions and comments out there. Okay, so to get started here, One of the challenges we have in reconstructing tallgrass prairies that function like the original ones that they're based on is trying to establish and maintain high levels of forb diversity. Many of the ecosystem services that we're banking on our reconstruction to give us, like pollinator habitat, nitrogen fixation, and others, are really only provided when there's a diverse abundance of native forbs. In attempts to restore diverse, abundant native forb communities should also be paired with the restoration of native grasses. But it is well documented that grasses can become overly dominant and make reconstruction look like the photo on the bottom right that's not really providing any of the benefits that forbs provide us. Usually this issue is ultimately caused by planting seed mixes that include too many seeds of large native grasses, but there certainly are some reports out there that claim grasses become overdominant even when seeding at lower rates. Now, one would think that too much native cover is better than not enough. Certainly, some have suggested that highly abundant native C4 grasses are actually providing an indirect positive effect on the forb community since they exclude weeds that would also compete with the forbs. However, at the end of the day, they are still directly competing with the forbs. And luckily, this question was recently disentangled by a study that found that no, the direct negative effects from overly abundant C4 grasses are considerably worse than any indirect positive effects that they're providing. So reconstructions that are heavily dominated by C4 grasses are a real issue. Now, throughout the talk, I'll be framing a lot of our discussion in the context of this Conservation Reserve Program, or CRP. I'll make the case here why I think that it does make sense to call many of our more recent practices in that program prairie reconstructions, but really this does apply just as equally to sort of lower cost reconstructions or ones that are using off-the-shelf seed mixes. Okay, so when we're talking about prairie reconstructions and CRP, at least in many parts of the Corn Belt, the majority of native plantings out there are enrolled in CRP or using a seed mix that's designed to meet CRP specifications. Even just looking at the two most prairie-like practices, there are over 600,000 acres in the Corn Belt. Historically, CRP plantings definitely have not resembled prairie reconstructions, and were really not specified to resemble prairies anyway. They tended to be grass stands, native or invasive. But more recently, increasing standards for native species seed mixes and the inclusion of more complex ecological goals. It means that practices like CP25 or CP42 really are striving more towards something that we would call prairie reconstruction. And because these more prairie-like practices are so widespread and scalable, they hold a lot of promise in providing the habitat that we need for monarch and other pollinator recovery. And this graph on the right here shows how much these CRP practices, those two important ones, have grown in recent years. Now, as part of these CRP programs, landowners are required to manage their plantings after 3 to 5 years after seeding. So that's what they call mid-contract management. And like many reconstructions managed by conservation organizations, they're commonly using spring burning as a management option. So from the perspective of maintaining a diverse and abundant forb community, this could be problematic since there's a large literature that shows that spring burning tends to increase dominant C4 grass abundance, which is then associated with declines in forb abundance. So we have this situation where widespread management practices on hundreds of thousands of acres are potentially setting us up for failure where monarch and other pollinator recovery might be concerned. So what are the alternatives if the traditional approach to managing prairie reconstructions might not be doing a great job of promoting forbs? Well, there's certainly some well understood options out there that do tend to promote forbs and not C4 grasses. Haying is a good option, but depending on your location, specifically in really intense corn country in Iowa and Illinois, there may not be very many farmers who still have hay equipment or nearby farmers that have any need for hay that's coming off prairie reconstruction. So that creates a situation where transporting the bales can be more expensive than any value of the hay, and then that makes hay logistically challenging. Fall burning also can work, but a lot of those days that are in prescription in the fall are often days when the crops are still up. And very few people are willing to risk something getting away during harvest season when corn is still up and you're burning near it. So that leaves us with one last approved management technique that might have some promise, and that is grass-selective herbicide application. So the idea here is to apply a selective herbicide that only impacts grass species in order to release forbs from competition and allow their abundance and diversity to increase. So when we talk about grass-selective herbicides, what we mean are the group 1 herbicides. So herbicides are categorized by their mode of action, which is the biochemical mechanism that damages the plant. There may be 15 to 20 relevant groups when it comes to agriculture and natural resource management. And group 1 is the only group that selectively targets grasses. These chemicals have a mode of action that blocks acetyl-CoA carboxylase, which is an enzyme that's needed to form lipids in the cells of grasses. And that's also what makes these herbicides grass selective. That ACCase enzyme is uniquely sensitive in Poaceae specifically, where it is not in most other families of plants, including other graminoids like sedges and rushes. So inhibiting that enzyme results in stunting and tissue death at growth points, which is typically lethal for seedlings and annual grasses. But for perennial grasses, larger grasses, this generally doesn't kill the plant. Rather, it stops or slows growth for a period of time. So there are a few sort of subcategories of the group 1 herbicides, but we're only going to be talking about ones that are relevant to natural areas management or typically thought of as relevant. Both have really bizarre names based on the suffix of the chemicals in their categories. The first ones are the DIMs, which are Clethodim and Clethodim. Both of those are used to control volunteer corn and other grasses and crop systems. And they also get used for perennial grass suppression. As is typical in pesticides, it's impossible to keep up with the marketing on them. So I couldn't pin down a go-to trade name for you on each of these. But Clethodim is the active ingredient in things like Select or Volunteer. They're now generic versions of Clethodim 2, I think. And then you find Clethodim in things like Post and Vantage. And then the other relevant category are the FOPs, which are commonly used in similar situations, definitely more on annual grasses. Commonly used one is fluazafop, which the active ingredient fusilade is fluazafop. So now the use of these group 1 herbicides has a pretty established track record in natural areas management. Most of the work on this actually comes out of the southeastern U.S. in quite prairie-like grasslands down there. So to just give a sense of what we already know to work in non-tallgrass prairie systems, it reduces cover of native warm-season grasses and some of those old school CRP dense BC spore grass stands, which tends, I guess, benefits quail down there. Now in those grass stands, there weren't really many forbs to increase, but in remnant native grasslands in Kentucky, grass-selective herbicides did work to increase native forbs and decrease the invasive fescue that had taken over those plant communities. So we have some good evidence that these grass-selective herbicides work in other systems and contexts, but what about in tallgrass prairie reconstructions? So we wanted to see if grass-selective herbicides could be useful as a management tool in prairie reconstruction. So we asked two questions. First, does grass-selective herbicide application increase pollinator or monarch habitat in prairie constructions? And two, does the type of seed mix planted, another way of saying CRP practice, determine effectiveness? So to answer our questions, we conducted a field experiment on existing prairie research plots. The original research plots were located in northeastern Iowa in a seed mix design experiment. Was originally established in 2015. Seed mix treatments in that experiment varied primarily in grass to forb ratio and mimicked NRCS approved CRP mixes commonly planted in Iowa. We'll talk a little bit more about those in depth in a minute here. And we also looked at two herbicide treatments, control and an application of the grass-selective herbicide Clethodim at the high end of the label recommended rate. Particularly, we chose Clethodim and not Clethodim, which is probably the other more common Group 1 herbicide, mostly because when we were talking to managers to kind of get a sense of how they were using these chemicals, they were kind of noting that Clethodim was the one that they noticed works the best, whereas Clethodim kind of didn't quite work as well. So we did go with Clethodim in this study. Okay, so here are the three seed mixes we compared, going back to those. The overall rate for the mixes was standardized to 40 seeds per square foot. So the main difference was how much of that was grass versus forbs. So we looked at an economy mix that was based on off-the-shelf mixes that met the specs for general wildlife cover mix, which was mostly grasses. This one had a 3-to-1 grass to forb ratio, so 30 seeds per square foot grass, 10 for forbs. Not very diverse, only 21 species. And then back in 2015, this mix cost $130 an acre, but those prices are not quite current, but they're pretty close. We also looked at a diversity mix, which was a balanced mix with a 1-to-1 grass to forb ratio. 20 seeds grass, 20 seeds per square foot forbs. And that one was quite diverse, 71 species. And we selected those species for mesic soils, which matched the planting site soils, and they were also native to eastern Iowa. Lastly, we looked at a generalized pollinator mix, which had the 1-to-3 grass to forb ratio as specified by most pollinator habitat practice standards. This one was also modeled on pre-prepared off-the-shelf mixes. Another thing that a lot of pollinator seed mixes specify are preference for short grasses. So most of our short grasses that are commercially available are dry adapted species like June grass or wet adapted species like fox sedge. So this mix really wasn't designed for the mesic soils on the site, but it did represent the kinds of mixes that have been popular over the past couple of years. Okay, so we collected pre-treatment data for this study in July 2021, and then we collected post-treatment data 1 year later, July 22, and a final follow-up year in July 23. So we used randomly placed transects in each experimental plot. We were measuring a couple metrics in 5.125 square meter quadrats related to forb abundance and potential pollinator and monarch habitat. So this included sown species richness, sown forb ramette density, sown inflorescence production, sown forb richness, and milkweed stems. And to compare the effects of herbicide, we looked at the change in each of these measures pre-treatment to post-treatment, and used ANOVA to analyze the change in habitat measures among herbicide and seed mix treatments. So to give you a sense of what the seed mixes looked like for herbicide application, this is what the stem density of sown forbs and some graminoids was pre-treatment. So plant communities more or less resembling the seed mix they were planted with. So the economy mix dominated by grass, limited forb abundance, diversity mix, sort of balanced grass and forb abundance, and then the pollinator mix dominated by forbs and very limited grass abundance. So for herbicide applications, we followed the guidelines set by the Iowa NRCS for contract management using herbicide in CB25 and 42 practices. So again, we use Clethodim, Clethodim 2E, which is the generic version of that. And 3 weeks prior to herbicide treatment, and the very day that the primary nesting season was over, we mowed treatment plots at 5 inches high to create a uniform, actively growing stand of vegetation. So the picture on the bottom left, bottom right is a photo of the plots right after mowing. And then on one randomly selected half of the experimental unit, the one that got mowed, the research farm attendant applied Clethodim at the high end of the label recommended rate, which is a little more than half a kilogram active ingredient per hectare, or 16 ounces of product per acre, along with crop oil concentrate adjuvant. That was on August 30th. That was when actively growing native warm season grasses were about 6 to 8 inches tall, which is kind of the high end of treatable plant size, but well within the suggestions. And so the untreated plots served as our control group and were left unmanaged. Okay, so let's take a look at what we found. So we didn't collect data on any immediate post-effect treatments, but we do have some observations. So a little bit over a month after the treatments, we found evidence the herbicide was working. So looking at Indian grass here, we can see in the control plots on the left the above ground growth points, that emerging leaf is healthy, green, and still growing. And comparing that with the plants in the Clethodim plots, where that emerging leaf is dead and there's damage to the existing leaves. So that's telling us that the shoot translocation was successful and that the herbicide was taken up successfully by the warm season grasses. Some more photos immediately post-treatment. Here we're seeing how carrick species forbs, including milkweeds, are undamaged and actively growing, while the warm season grasses are brown and damaged. Another photo, lots of forb growth. Here we're looking at mostly natives like yellow coneflower, wild bergamot, golden Alexander, but we do have some non-natives in there like dandelion and wild carrot that are growing well. And some of the smooth blue aster that we had was even blooming after our treatments. And then finally, broader view, again showing in the treated areas, you've got forbs and sedges growing strongly, while the native warm season grasses are not really growing much at all. So now let's take a look at how Clethodim application affected things. The way we'll walk through each metric is that we'll show Clethodim effects on prairie reconstructions overall, and then we'll drill down to see how Clethodim is affecting the different seed mixes. So looking at forb stem density here, again, this is the overall effect of Clethodim averaged over all seed mixes. So we have stem density on the y-axis, time on the x-axis. The pre-treatment measurements are on the far left, and then as we go to the right, we have 1 year post-treatment and then 2 years post-treatment. And so we see a big increase in forb abundance a year after treatment. And Inova showed that's effect to be statistically significant. But after that first year, we see forb abundance kind of return more or less to something closer to pre-treatment levels. So now looking at individual seed mixes. So with this graph, we have 3 panels. Each one is showing the response in the 3 seed mixes, where time is again on the x-axis. Again, on the y-axis, we have forb stem density. So the thing to point out here is that we're finding the effects of Clethodim on the grassier mixes. Significant changes in the grass-dominated economy mix, less so in the diversity mix, and then no difference in the pollinator mix. And again, note how the effects are temporary. And also to add to the forb abundance story, we took a look at milkweed abundance in particular, but we didn't find an effect there, and so we're not going to be looking at that data. There's a lot of variation in milkweed abundance with seed mixes. A lot of the pollinator mixes had a ton, and grass economy mixes didn't have any. So hard to make good comparisons there. Okay. Now we're going to look at change in flower abundance. Again, we're looking at the overall effects first. We're going to drill down into the effects of seed mix. So overall, Clethodim really increased flowering, approximately doubled flower abundance the year after treatment. Most of this increase was from a few species, particularly yellow coneflower, but again, a temporary effect. Flowering is back to pre-treatment after 2 years. Now again, looking within seed mixes, we found the effects of Clethodim, again, were most pronounced in the grassy mixes, the economy and diversity mix, and there was not a significant change in the pollinator mix. Looking now at species richness and floral richness overall, here we didn't really find any effects from Clethodim. So this helps us see that the overall plant community didn't change very much. It was really just some of those common existing forbs that produced more stems and more flowers in the year following application. So looking at effects within seed mixes here, again with species richness and floral richness, we did find in the diversity mix there was some evidence that Clethodim increased floral richness, but that was unique to that mix and metric. And then finally, we'll look at change in grass abundance. Surprised by this, we didn't see any effect of Clethodim on grass stems, but given the suppressive and not lethal nature of Clethodim on the large perennial grasses, it's likely the grasses simply recovered quite quickly and were totally recovered at the peak of the growing season post-treatment. Quick look at grass abundance in each of the seed mixes. No real interesting trends here, but somewhat strangely, we found pretty big decreases in grass abundance regardless of herbicide treatment in the economy mix. And it's unclear what might have been responsible for that. So here's a good example of what it looked like on the ground. This is a grass-dominated series of plots prior to treatment. So focus on the left plot, which was sprayed. There are definitely forbs present, but they're not really abundant. And then the same plots a year after Clethodim application, the increased abundance of forbs and flowers is pretty apparent here, I think. There's quite a lot more forbs in Clethodim plots. And next year, that tree got cut down, and the same plots again, and really no detectable differences here. There's just a lot of flowers everywhere this year. So let's summarize all that data. So when we evaluated the effectiveness of grass-selective herbicide application to increase pollinator habitat in different prairie reconstruction seed mixes, we found that using Clethodim temporarily increased flower and forb abundance, didn't change milkweed stem density or grass abundance, and was generally more impactful in grassy mixes. But some of those effects were statistically inconclusive. So now let's talk about how these results compare to other common management techniques. So how does it compare to the things we already use? And specifically, I want to compare Clethodim to prescribed fire, since that's ultimately the most likely method to be in competition. Perhaps surprisingly, there are very few studies out there that assess the effects of a single fire in a prairie reconstruction. There's a lot of comparisons of fire regimes, but very little on single fires. So I did find one study, and luckily we have some fairly comparable metrics to look at. So I tried to take one of the figures from this paper and extract some relevant findings. Okay, so Randa and Younger looked at biomass after some management treatments in fairly young prairie reconstruction, burning and mowing. And we don't have pre-burn data here, but if we look at the 2 times shaded in blue, that's kind of similar to our year 1 and year 2 post-treatment data. So if you can recall back to what we found in our plots, was that, no difference in graminoid abundance, but a big increase in forb abundance. And it's somewhat similar to what they found. Both prescribed fire and grass-selective herbicide primarily is increasing forb abundance. And so, and the other important thing that's somewhat interesting and not surprising is that both of those single applications of herbicide or fire produce temporary results. Now, all pesticides have the potential for off-target effects, and Clethodim is not an exception to that. There are not a lot of studies out there that have looked at Clethodim's negative effect on non-target organisms, but those that have suggest they may have some limited negative effects on invertebrates and plants. So mostly based on studies in the Pacific Northwest, the effects on forb seem to be very minor and outweighed by positive indirect effects of grass suppression. But the potential effects on invertebrates are a bit more of a concern. And unfortunately, we have very limited evidence to go on. At least with checker spot butterflies up in the Northwest, we know there could be up to around 15% mortality with Clethodim exposure, but the statistics are inconclusive when compared to the controls in the study that looked at that. So there are potential risks associated with this management practice. So with that, I think we have some evidence that the application of grass-selective herbicides, Clethodim in particular, might be a useful management technique that can promote forbs and prairie reconstruction, if only temporarily, especially when other forb promoting management options might not be feasible. Using Clethodim seems to be most useful in grassy reconstructions, so seed mixes that are grass dominated or grass forb balanced, they seem to benefit the most. When considering the risks associated with Clethodim to non-target organisms, it does seem that the rewards might outweigh the risks to pollinators, given there were very large, though temporary, increases in forb and flower abundance. A little bit differently, for reconstructions with minor grass abundance, typical pollinator plantings, this is really not a useful management practice. Clethodim in these plantings did not decrease grasses further than they already were, nor did it promote forbs. So prescribed burn is probably going to be more likely to promote forbs in those types of mixes, since in those situations at least litter is removed and might increase light to small plants. So it might be worth revisiting whether grass-specific herbicide targeting worm-season grasses should remain an approved option. It really kind of would only be a situation where you have pollinator mixes that are invaded by cool season grasses that might be one for further study. And then finally, one Clethodim application does not seem to be sufficient to shift the plant community towards a more forb-dominated stand. So, like fire, you're probably going to need to apply grass-selective herbicide more than once to tip the competitive scales long term. And then to start wrapping up here, there's a lot of areas where we need to devote more research in the realm of using grass-selective herbicides to promote forbs. First, it's important to look further into the timing of the application. So the timing of application for our study was after nesting season and when warm season grasses were kind of at peak growth. The downside to that is that the pre-treatment mowing management that we needed to do to create a uniform treatable stand also mowed off milkweeds in the month of August, which is a very important time for monarchs to be having high quality habitat. So while it did increase nectar sources in the following year, if we could do applications in May and get similar results before nesting season, you could produce a net positive outcome for monarch habitat rather than the more ambiguous situation that we found. We also need to look into how many times we have to treat with Clethodim to actually produce long-term increases in forb abundance. So specifically, we need to find the minimum effective frequency. So we're not applying more herbicide than we need to be. And then finally, we should look into how does some of the pre-spray management regime affects results. So, you could easily apply a Clethodim in the spring after a fire. Anything that creates a uniform short stand of actively growing vegetation is going to be a good pre-spray management option. Fires are one of those, and that may increase the benefits to forbs even further than what we found with simple mowing. So lots of avenues for further research that I think are. So with that, I'm going to wrap up here and want to thank my collaborators and funders, and happy to take any of your questions and comments. And I guess we'll open it up to Jamie can field some of those.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Justin, for this presentation and your research of you and your collaborators to hopefully, put another tool in our toolbox of prairie management. I'll go ahead and get started with a question here in the chat from Kurt Vacek, and then I will do the controls of unmuting folks. So I'm curious about already established prairie reconstructions, 5 years old plus, and now seeing invasion by brome. Any idea if grass-selective herbicides are more or less effective on cool season grasses versus warm season? And any difference in DIMs versus FOPs for impacts on sedges, which might be safest to use when desirable sedges are present?
Yeah, Good question. So, so the first question about brome, when I was looking, doing literature review for this project, I was disappointed to find that nobody has published with brome in mind. So again, a lot of this research is more southeast and northwest focused. So um, so that one is kind of an open question. I can say that in general conversations with other managers, they've uh, noted that Clethodim is quite effective on brome. I have not myself, studied that part, but maybe folks can chime in later on. Um, the uh, um, the second part with respect to sedges and other desirable graminoids. So to my understanding, um, so FOPs and DIMs are both act on that same enzyme that is fairly specific to grasses alone. And I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think those two are, or any of the group one herbicides are likely to damage desirable sedges or rushes.
Okay, thank you very much, Justin. You'll see another question there. Kathy asks, don't know if you have sedges and rushes in your prairies, but wondering if you've been able to retain these with grass-specific sprays.
So, we have, let me see if I can show, oops, let me share a specific slide for you guys. This is kind of getting at the question. So this is a photo of a sedge. The green, healthy looking plant on the left is a sedge, and that was about a month after treatment. So, without, having specific data, I know that they didn't change with respect to the abundance, which is probably more of a situation about a lot of variance than it is about equality. But you see something like that, you feel pretty good about that, and I think that we can be pretty comfortable. If you're ever curious, you just try it on a small area and see. But it's always a good practice to start small. But I think the evidence would point towards sedges being quite tolerant.
Yeah, that's really good to know. Jeffrey has there's a comment here. I've used Clethodim on brome, and it gives roughly a 1 growing season suppression of brome, but back to normal the next growing season. Oh, that is good. Good knowledge to pass around.
That really that tracks with kind of our results as well. Is that the necessity of, or the one and done, the silver bullet probably doesn't exist out there. So.
Well, Ryan asked, to your knowledge, has there ever been any research conducted about utilizing some form of light tillage or tillage herbicide for grass control? I know it's not exactly something that would have been a historic disturbance, but just curious if it has been tried at all. I'm thinking if there is a benefit, it would probably be on older reconstructions.
Yeah, so I didn't talk about that other option that folks have for CRP, which is disking. But it's one of those things that it just seems like it'll bring up annual weeds. Any kind of soil disturbance tends to be something that benefits unwanted plants. However, we don't have a lot of research on that management practice in, sort of higher quality prairie reconstructions. There, I think, are some studies on kind of that old school CRP grass stand type stuff, um, where it does kind of suppress the dominant grasses a little bit, but yeah, an avenue for more research. It's one of
And
those things
that's
that's kind of gone by the wayside.
well, and like you said, that's still within possible recommendations within the practice, right? For disking. So there might be some knowledge out there. It just hasn't gotten into the
Yeah,
hadn't gotten
yeah,
into the
you can.
literature.
Yeah, there's definitely anecdotes out there. You'll A lot of
Okay.
people are doing it. It's just a matter we haven't really took a magnifying glass to it.
Okay. Okay, Susan asks or makes a comment here, familiar with using Sidoxadim on reed canary grass, a cool season grass that gave good one season effect, but not longer. Again, similar on some of those other cool seasons. Andrew asks, did you look at changes in forb diversity as opposed to rammet diversity, or did you see changes in the distribution of bloom phenology?
Yeah, good question. We did look at some basic species richness metrics. I'll show those here. Um, One caveat, not necessarily caveat, but explanation of some of this data. This is the raw data, and when I'm talking about significance and statistical testing, we're using actual changes in plots, and this is just raw um, average data. Um, so there are some places where it may look like there's a significant difference, but when you actually just look at the change from individual plots and do the stats on that, you don't get a statistical difference. Um, so anyway, putting that aside, here's looking at species richness and floral richness. Um, didn't really have much difference in species richness, but again, we did have some evidence for an increase in floral richness in the diversity mix. So yeah, it was mostly. I can go back to the photograph. As you can see, it's mostly the Retivida pinnata, that yellow coneflower, that was really benefited by that, and that was also the most abundant forb there before. So I think it's not doesn't seem to be allowing or promoting new forbs, but it is promoting the forbs that are already there. So um, diversity kind of stayed the same. Now, we didn't look at a metric like effective species or something like that, which may very well be a good thing to follow up with, because taking into account the abundance of things and evenness, probably a good idea.
Okay, thanks, Justin. Others, just to add some more to that tillage conversation, Nebraska Game and Parks did extensive work in CRP management in the early 2000s using tillage along with interseeding. Much of this research ended up as those at UNI. Okay, let's see. Severin Seifert asks, other than dandelions, did you notice higher amounts of non-native species following the herbicide treatment?
That's a good question, and one, I left out some of the data for non-planted species for sake of time, and also that we didn't find any difference. So we did look at annual weed cover and perennial weed cover, and none of that was different. So So that's the good news. I kind of did think that some of the pollinator plantings, which had a lot of Canada thistle in them, would just be kind of released. Any of those grasses that were in there would have been hit, and then kind of would competitive release to Canada thistle, but that luckily did not happen. So.
Okay, ready for more? So Renee asked, are there any data or future data on multiple applications of grass selective or multiple season applications with non-selective herbicides like glyphosate?
Let's see. There's lots of stuff out there with glyphosates. I don't think I could give you a good overview. I didn't quite delve into that very much in the scope of this project, but it's definitely out there. People are doing a lot of different things with timing, like early in the season glyphosate applications I hear are effective that don't necessarily impact the native plants. However, I have my questions about that too. So I guess I would say, yeah, maybe take a look at the literature and see what other folks are finding.
Okay. Dan asks, can Clethodim be sprayed in successive years?
Yes, follow the label, but I don't think there's any. There are limits on how much you should apply per growing season, I think, or year. But it's supposed to be pretty quick to break down.
Okay. That's what I'm going to ask, if there's any, if you were seeing, or if other know, or the literature says there's any what carryover effects we might see with some of those.
Right. At least on the side of the EPA, kind of the basics. The carryovers are kind of in line with a lot of the other commonly used natural areas, like triclopyr
Okay.
or glyphosate.
The glyphosate breaks.
Order of weeks usually.
Pretty short half-lives on those. Clarissa makes a comment. The Iowa DNR Prairie Resource Center uses spring burns and spraying grass select, some years no spray, and they have some of the highest forb abundance I've ever seen in those fields.
Yes, this is I talked to Bill at the Prairie Resource Center to run this idea past him first. So yes, that is that would be the place to go. Yeah, Bill Johnson at the Iowa DNR Prairie Research Center has used this to great effect, and it'd be great to get him to give a talk or something.
Oh, right. Yeah, if I can. Yeah. Jonathan asked, any idea if the ratio of perennial to annual grasses changed pre-treatment versus 2-year post-treatment?
Right. I don't think we've gotten. I don't think the resolution was particularly high enough to look at that question, but I can say that again, we didn't find any differences. So from year one, basically from pre-treatment to post-treatment, 2 years after post-treatment, we're seeing about the same abundance of annual and perennial weeds. As far as natives, we don't have any native annual grasses of note in these plots, so that isn't quite relevant. The one thing that did change, or at least I did run the stats on it, but it looks pretty clear, was that some of the unplanted native species, like specifically it was frost aster, that did volunteer itself the year after in some of the plots. So that was the one thing that was noteworthy that I didn't necessarily talk about, but I figured it was kind of in line with the general message anyway. So.
Okay, very, very good. I guess not an unwanted, not necessarily an unwanted weed. Laura asks, regarding these Clethodim and Clethodim applications with good effects in the first year only, is it a possibility that active ingredient concentrations were too high and the plants were top killed without translocating the herbicide to the roots?
That's a good question. So the way that these herbicides work, I don't think that was the case. You could kind of see when I was looking at the plants a year or a month after application. The it wasn't like you get what the vegetation didn't look like you get when you do a glyphosate application or something that is a truly systematic or systemic kind of killing type herbicide. So this stuff really just stunts it and kind of slowly kind of prevents it from growing, which is also why you tend to always get this rebound in the second year, as far as I could surmise. So I don't think we were having issues with top kill. I think it's, a lot of the, when you're thinking about the label recommendations with this particular, with Clethodim, most of those lower rates are spec'd for, like small annual grasses, like crabgrass and things like that. So, when you're thinking about applying it to a big blue stem that's 7 foot tall, I don't think those are probably going to be overly aggressive. But it is a good question. And obviously, a follow-up study would be to actually look at those different rates, because it's not a cheap herbicide either. So if you can get good results with lower rates, that would be ideal.
Yeah, because that's going to definitely, right, those cost of any of those management actions are going to, impact, whether they get done or not, right? Okay, so Justin, you mentioned haying as a practice, so here's a haying question. Kurt asked, I'm curious what you or others feel about timing of haying for maintaining forb diversity. Is there a window when we can damage the grasses but benefit the forb? So it's getting a little bit away from the herbicide, but it's still right on track with prairie reconstruction management. So like example, the boot stage on Big Blue, and so any thoughts on that, Justin?
I'll probably have to punt on that one. I mean, I could speculate, but I know there's probably people in this chat that have a lot of good experience on that. So
Yeah, and it looks like there's
I'm
been
gonna
some
pass.
other thought. And then there's another question from John. Any thoughts about the best way to expand a remnant prairie into new areas where brush such as buckthorn has been removed without it becoming grass not dominated, especially when grass is needed as fuel for fire? So there might be a little bit bigger, longer.
Yeah, I think I would say your seed mix is going to help you determine that. So don't, make sure you're managing your seed mix so that it doesn't go into territory where, grass dominance is an issue. So as you saw with this study, right, the pollinator mix didn't have much grass to begin with, and so, didn't have a problem with grass overabundance. So that's, kind of the first step is prevention.
Okay, and then looks like Calvin responded that Shaw Nature Reserve in Missouri is experimenting with fusillade treatments, and I guess fusillade's the trade name for an herbicide, Treatments and overseeding with higher conservation value forbs in grass-dominated prairie construction from the 80s and 90s. Stay tuned for statistical results, but preliminary conclusions are similar in that fusillade sets back warm season grasses temporarily, and forb germination is limited. And so, Justin, thank you for doing similar work, and I hope more folks look into these questions. And then Kevin comments, typically herbicides have a wait period after the plant experiences stress, such as clipping before the herbicide should be applied. Otherwise, it won't translocate to the roots. And then, right, same for drought.
Yep, exactly. Which is why we waited about a month before we applied herbicide to those stands. We mowed it in early, basically August 1st, and waited till August 30th to apply the herbicide. That's definitely a very important caveat to doing applications.
And you feel like you had sufficient soil moisture for active growing?
Yeah, this is like it was crazy that it was a very dry year in 2021, but August was not a dry year or a dry month. So we actually got above average precip. So
okay,
so I feel pretty good that. So feel pretty good that we got the correct amount of precipitation for this to work. So
okay,
but yeah, that is important point. If you do know it's a drought, don't waste your time on trying to apply this herbicide. It is specifically, I think, is especially sensitive to getting good translocation throughout the plant for it to be effective. So something to keep in mind.
Yeah, Kathy has a comment and puts out a question. Being used extensively in western rangelands, a pre-emergent Rejuvra active ingredient is indaziflam, is being used to control annual invasive grasses, especially cheat grass. Have folks looked into using this?
It's interesting. I don't know that one. There was a third group 1 subcategory that I didn't cover because I had never heard of it used in, but maybe that's part of that group. I'm not sure.
Okay.
So.
Well, we're near the end of our time. I guess one more bit of information from Jeffrey. Boot stage to mid bloom. Cut the grass short to get below the growing point. Similar to herbicide, usually gets one growing season the following year of suppression of warm season grasses, so it can release brome and bluegrass if they are on site, though, so have to evaluate each field individually some more. So maybe some mechanical management in there in your toolbox to think about. So okay, that we've run to the end of our time that we've allotted for this webinar today. I hope you're able to join us next week. And Justin, thank you very much for your time and your research and your presentation today.
Thanks, Jamie. It's a lot of fun.
Okay, folks, have a great day. And we'll see you down